He's not in his right mind. He's just a broke-down old miner who couldn't tell you what year it is. My own daughter said that. Said it slow and clear into the microphone so the court reporter wouldn't miss a word of it. Somebody in the back row laughed. Just one. Then a second one, quieter, the way people laugh when they know they oughtn't, but it got away from them anyway. 46 years I raised that girl, fed her, paid for her, walked her down an aisle, and I sat in a folding chair in a Letcher County courtroom while she explained to a judge that I couldn't be trusted with my own name. Her lawyer had been at it the better part of an hour. He had charts, friend. He had a chart about me, and I hadn't said one word the whole time. Not one. Then they called their doctor up to the front, the county's own man, the one whose signature was going to put me in a facility over in Lexington. Nice-looking fellow, gray suit, silver at the temples, folder tucked under his arm like a man who has never once dropped anything in his life. I looked at him a good long while, and I said, "Son, you still carry my tag?" His pen stopped moving, stopped right in the middle of a word. Then his hand went into his coat pocket before he could tell it not to. The room went so quiet I could hear the heat kick on, but that ain't the part that mattered. The part that mattered was what was in that pocket, and what it cost to put it there, and the fact that not one soul in that courtroom, not the judge, not the lawyer, not my daughter, not my grandson, had ever once thought to ask. My name is Hollis Rainey. I'm 77 years old. I live on Rockhouse Creek in Letcher County, Kentucky, in the same house my daddy put up in 1951, and I have never in my life lived more than 9 miles from where I was born. I went to Vietnam in 1968 because they told me to. I was 5'6" and 140 pounds soaking wet, and it turned out the Army had a particular use for a small fellow from a coal county who wasn't afraid of a hole in the ground. So they gave me a flashlight and a pistol, and they sent me down into the tunnels. 2 years of that. Then I come home in 1970 and went underground again, and stayed there 22 years. And when my back finally quit on me, and they moved me topside, I signed onto the volunteer mine rescue team, and I stayed on that team for 40 years. Here's the first thing they teach you in mine rescue, friend. It's the first rule, and it's the last one, and everything in between is just details. You never go in alone, and you never come out alone. 2 men in, 2 men out, always. You don't leave a partner in the dark, not for 1 minute, not for one reason, not ever. I lived by that rule for 40 years. I could recite it in my sleep, and some nights I did, and it took me most of 80 years on this earth to understand that rule was never one bit about the mine. Remember that, friend. That's the whole story right there. The rest is just how long it took me to find out. Now, there's a footlocker at the foot of my bed. Been there since 1971. Green Army thing, dented on one corner, my name stenciled on the lid in letters going soft. And inside that footlocker, in a rubber band, there are 12 birthday cards, one for every year since my wife died. All of them written, all of them signed, all of them sealed up and stamped. Not one of them ever mailed. My daughter was going to end up reading one of those cards out loud in that courtroom, in front of every person in it, and her own lawyer was going to be the one who handed it to her. But I'll get to that. Judge Ada Mullins called a 15-minute recess about 4 seconds after I asked that doctor about my tag, and she called it in a voice that had come loose at the edges. I sat right where I was and folded my hands. Cheryl Dawn's lawyer, big fellow name of Roland Pike, come up from Lexington, suit worth more than my truck. Roland Pike leaned over and started whispering at her fast, and she wasn't listening to a word of it. She was looking at me. And I'll tell you something, friend. That was the first time in about 12 years my daughter actually looked at me instead of past me. She didn't know who I was, 46 years old, and she was sitting there in a good gray dress I'd never seen, finding out she'd never met her daddy. Let me back up and tell you how a man ends up in a room like that. I married Ruthie Combs in 1974. Met her at a fish fry down at the Methodist Church, which is where everything in this county has ever happened. She had a laugh on her that could turn a room around. She was the talker. I was the one standing behind her with my hat in my hands. That was the arrangement, and it worked for 40 years. Ruthie said the words, and I did the work. Ruthie remembered the birthdays, and I made sure there was money for them. Ruthie told Cheryl Dawn that her daddy loved her, and I let her, because she was better at it and because I truly did believe she was saying it on my behalf. That's a fine system, friend. It works right up until the person saying your words for you dies. Ruthie went in January of 2014. Cancer. And it took 9 months, and I was there for every hour of it, and I did not say one useful thing that whole time. Not one. I hauled her to Lexington and back 41 times. I learned to run a feeding tube. I slept in a chair for 6 weeks straight. And when she went, all the words in my house went with her. Cheryl Dawn called me that spring. Called me 3, 4 times. And I'd pick up and she'd talk and I'd say, mm-hmm, and all right, and I reckon so. And after a while, there'd just be this silence on the line. And she'd say, Daddy? And I'd say, I'm here. And that was a lie, friend. Because I wasn't. I wasn't anywhere. And then she stopped calling. I want to be honest with you because I promised at the front of this that I would. She didn't leave. I want that on the record. She called and I gave her nothing back, and eventually a person quits knocking on a door that don't open. That is not cruelty. That is arithmetic. She married Dale and moved to Lexington and got her real estate license and did well. Real well. Big house in a subdivision where every mailbox matches. And every year at Christmas I'd get a card with a photograph in it and her handwriting on the back, and my grandbaby Cole getting a foot taller in every one. And every year in March, I'd drive to the Rite Aid in Whitesburg and stand in front of the birthday cards for the better part of an hour like a fool. Last October, a woman I didn't know knocked on my door with a clipboard and told me she was there to do an assessment. And that's the first I heard of any of it. Cheryl Dawn had filed on me. Petition for guardianship and conservatorship. Says here Hollis Rainey lacks the capacity to manage his person and his property. Says here he's a danger to himself, living alone on a mountain at 77 with a wood stove and no cell signal. She wanted a facility, place called Sunrise Meadows. And she wanted the 60 acres on Rockhouse Creek, the home place, and there was a man from Ohio who wanted to put cabins on it. I read that paper standing on my own porch, and I'll tell you what I felt. Not anger, friend. Tired. Just tired, all the way down to the floor of me. I got a lawyer out of Hazard because he was the first name in the book. I told him the truth. I didn't have much fight in me, and I wasn't real interested in finding some. Everybody in that county had been telling me for 10 years that I'd gone quiet and strange. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had. So we went to court in February, and Roland Pike stood up there and took me apart for an hour with a smile on his face. He said I hadn't spoke to my daughter in 11 years. True. He said I hadn't been to a doctor in 9. True. He said I sat alone on a mountain and didn't answer my phone and hadn't cut my own grass since 2019. All true. Every word of it true. And then he got to the part he'd been saving. He said, in 2011 I sold 40 acres of family land, the back 40. Up on the ridge. Land my granddaddy had bought with money he made timbering. Sold it in 1 week to a stranger, well under what it was worth, and had never once, in 15 years, given anybody a reason why. That's when it started, Your Honor, he said. 2011. That's when this man's judgment left him, and I sat there with my hands folded, and I did not say a word. Then they called Dr. Wyatt Boone. He was 48 years old, board certified in geriatric psychiatry, 22 published papers. The county contracted him for competency evaluations, which means his whole job that day was to stand up there and tell a judge whether an old man gets to keep his own life. He'd spent 2 hours in my kitchen back in December. Asked me the year, the president, count back from 100 by 7s. Asked me to draw a clock. I drew him a clock. And he never once looked at my face while I did it. Kept his eyes on the paper the entire time. He was sworn in, and Roland Pike asked him for his findings, and Dr. Boone opened his folder, and then he closed it again. Your Honor, he said, before I say anything else, I have to disclose something to the court. Pike's head come up like a dog hearing a truck. I've been sitting here 2 hours trying to talk myself out of it, Boone said. I can't. Judge Mullins called another recess. He caught me in the hallway by the water fountain. Big man, and he was shaking, and he couldn't get his hand out of his coat pocket for a second. Then he got it out. And there in that man's palm was a brass tag, worn down to almost nothing, with a hole punched through the top of it and a number stamped in it. Number 41. If you don't know what that is, friend, let me tell you. In a coal mine, every man carries a brass check, numbered. When you go in, you take your tag off the board at the mouth, and you carry it with you. When you come out, you hang it back on the hook, and that board is how they know. That board is the whole system. If your tag has gone off that hook at the end of a shift, then you are still down there, and they are coming for you. Your tag is not jewelry. Your tag is the thing that says somebody's going to come looking. I hadn't laid eyes on mine in 29 years. I've carried it every day, Wyatt Boone said. Every single day since I was 19 years old. I have never once left the house without it, and I couldn't get anything out of my throat at all. It was the 2nd of August, 1997, sang branch number 4, up past Blackie. Roof fall in a section they had no business working. A block of draw rock come down about 180 feet in from the last open crosscut, and it brought half the entry with it, and when the dust settled, there were 4 men on the wrong side of it. 3 of them dug themselves out in about 40 minutes. The 4th one didn't. I was 48 then. Been on the team 6 years, and when we got up there and got a look at what we were dealing with, it was ugly. That entry had squeezed down to maybe 18, 20 inches in the tightest of it, and it was working. You could hear it. A mind talks, friend. It pops and it groans and it tells you exactly what it's fixing to do if you'll shut up and listen. And there wasn't a man on that team who could fit through that hole. Except one. I want you to understand something, and I'm not saying it to sound brave, because I wasn't. I was scared out of my mind. But I had spent 2 years of my life crawling into holes in the ground in a country on the other side of the world, and my body knew how to do it even when the rest of me was screaming, and that is not courage. That is just damage that happened to be useful one time. So I went in. Took me an hour and 10 minutes to make 180 feet, on my belly the whole way, no room to lift my head, dragging a line behind me. And about halfway in the entry pinched down, and I had to turn my head sideways and blow all the air out of my chest to get through. And there was a moment there, I've never told anybody this, there was a moment where I couldn't go forward and I couldn't go back, and I laid there in the dark and I made my peace with it. Then I got through. And there he was, 19 years old, 4 months underground, working summers to pay for school, got a rock across him from the hip down, and it was the size of a deep freeze, and there was not one thing in this world I could do about it. You don't lift a rock like that, you crib it. You bring in timbers and jacks, and you build a house around it, and you take the weight off an inch at a time, and every one of those inches you might bring the rest of that roof down on both of you, which meant we had to wait. I got to him at about 6 that evening. They cut him loose at 3 the next morning. 9 hours, friend. 9 hours in a space too small to sit up in, with a boy who couldn't feel his legs, and rock ticking over our heads the whole time like a clock that's mad at you. And after about 5 hours, my light started to go. You carry a cap lamp with a battery on your belt. And they're good for a long shift, and mine had a long shift on it already, and it went from white to yellow to that awful brown, and I watched that boy watch it go, and I saw what was happening behind his eyes. That boy could take the rock. He could take the pain. What he could not take was the dark. So I unbuckled that battery off my belt, and I unhooked the lamp off my hat, and I put the whole rig in his hands, and I closed his fingers around it. And I said, "It's yours now. You hold it." And he said, "What about you?" And I said, "I've been in the dark before, son. It don't know me." And then I sat in the black for 4 hours. I want you to try and understand what mind dark is, because it is not like anything up here. It is not night. Night has a sky in it. Mind dark has weight, friend. You put your hand in front of your eyes and there's nothing there, and after a while your eyes start making things up just to have something to do, and you have to decide, over and over, not to believe them. And I talked to that boy for 4 hours. About nothing. About his mama. About a girl he liked. About whether the Wildcats had a chance. Every time he'd go quiet, I'd ask him something dumb, and he'd answer. And as long as he was answering, we were both still in that mind together. 2 men in, 2 men out. And near the end of it, when we could hear them getting close, he asked me if he was going to die. And I couldn't lie to him, because you don't. Not down there. So I took my tag off my belt, and I found his hand in the dark, and I pressed that brass into it, and I told him what it meant. I told him as long as that tag was gone off the hook, there was not one man on this mountain who was going home. They cut him out at 3 in the morning. I come out behind him and somebody put a blanket on me, and I got in my truck and I drove home and I took a shower and I went to work on second shift that same day. And I never saw him again. Not for 29 years. Now, standing there in that hallway, that man told me the rest of it. He told me he went back to school that fall, and he couldn't sleep, couldn't be in a closed room, couldn't ride an elevator, told his mother he was fine. And he told me he changed his major. I have spent 30 years of my life, he said, studying what fear does to the human mind. I've got a wall of paper that says I'm an expert in it. And then he had to stop for a second. I had one teacher, he said. One. And he sat in the dark for 4 hours so I wouldn't have to. And he never told me his name, and I have spent 29 years looking for him. And I stood there in a courthouse hallway at 77 years old, and I could not say one word back to him. Here's the thing I've turned over more than any other, friend, and I'll give it to you straight. I spent 40 years crawling into the dark after other people. And every one of those 40 years I had a light on my hat, and a light on my belt, and a spare in my kit. Because you never go in without one, and you never go in without a spare. That's the rule. That's the whole religion of it. And I never once, not one time in my entire life, turned any one of those lights on where somebody who loved me could see where I was at. Ruthie died knocking on that door. Cheryl Dawn quit knocking on that door. And I was in there the whole time, friend. I was right in there, with the switch under my thumb. Now, let me tell you about 2011, since Roland Pike brought it up. In 2011, Dale got laid off from the plant in Georgetown. 4 months, no work, and they had a house and a baby and a car note. They got 4 payments behind, and then they got a letter, and Cheryl Dawn never told me. I found out from Ruthie, who found out from a cousin, which is how everything is found out in this county. So I sold the back 40. Took me 9 days. Took the first offer, which is why it went cheap. Because 9 days is not how you sell land. It's how you sell land when a bank is counting. And I wired every dime of it to a mortgage company in Louisville. And then Ruthie called our daughter and told her the bank had restructured the note. Told her it was some kind of government program. Told her it happens all the time. That was 2011. My granddaddy bought that ridge with timber money in 1919, and I sold it in 9 days and never told a soul on this earth why. And my wife carried that lie for 3 years, and then she died with it. And in February of 2026, a man in a good suit stood in a courtroom and held that up as Exhibit C. Proof my mind had left me, and I let him. Because the only way to defend myself was to stand up in a public room and tell my daughter that her whole life was a thing I bought and never mentioned. And what kind of a gift is that, friend? That's not a gift. That's a bill. Next morning, the courthouse lot in Whitesburg was full at 8 o'clock, and it had no business being. I saw the trucks first, old ones, and men standing around in the cold in canvas coats, drinking coffee out of gas station cups, some of them on canes. A couple with oxygen bottles on little carts, on account of what 40 years of rock dust does to a man's lungs. Junior Caudill was the first one to see me get out of my truck. Junior's 81. We were on the team together for 19 years. He said, "Morning, 41. That's what they called me. My whole life on that team, that's what they called me, and I hadn't heard it out loud in 11 years, and it about took my legs out from under me." And then Denver Combs, who runs the squad now and wasn't but a boy when I left it, come around the side of a truck carrying a cardboard box. And then 2 more men behind him with 2 more boxes. Run logs. Every call that squad has answered since 1961. They set 3 boxes of them on the floor of that courtroom, and Denver Combs told Judge Mullins that if the court wanted to know what Hollis Rainey's judgment was worth, it was all wrote down right there in his own hand, and she was welcome to read every page. And back at the end of the gallery, standing up, hat off, with a tube in his nose and a tank on a cart, was Arliss Fields. I brought Arliss out of a fire in 1989, carried him 1,200 feet. He's 84 now, and he cannot walk to his own mailbox. He drove himself 1 hour and 10 minutes and stood the whole morning. I said, "Junior, y'all are making a scene." Junior Caudill said, 41, that's the entire idea. Now, I want you to slow down with me here, friend, because this is the part I've thought about every night since. This is the longest 15 minutes of my life. Roland Pike put me on the stand, and he came for me. He said, "Mr. Rainey, would you agree you've been emotionally absent from your daughter's life for over a decade?" I said, "Yes, sir. That's fair." And it threw him. It threw him because I said it plain, and I said it quick. He said, "Would you agree that your combat service left you psychologically compromised?" And I said, "Yes, sir." The room got real still. He said, "So, you admit you're not competent to manage your own affairs?" And I said, "No." And he spread his hands out like I'd walked into it. "What's the difference?" And I looked over at my daughter for about half a second before I answered him. "The difference," I said, "is that I'm damaged. I ain't absent. I've been sitting on that mountain for 11 years about 4 miles from a phone that don't ring, and I have thought about that girl every single day, and there is not one thing wrong with my mind. There's something wrong with my mouth. He come right back. He said, love that never gets spoken isn't love, Mr. Rainey. It's neglect. And friend, that's the part that hurt. Because he wasn't wrong. And I said, sometimes it is. Yes, sir. And he turned toward the bench like he'd won it. And that's when he made his mistake. He picked up the property inventory. See, when you file to take a person's estate, you inventory the estate. Her lawyer had sent people into my house in November with clipboards, and they had wrote down every single thing I own. Item 41 on that list was a footlocker, and under it, in a lawyer's typing, 12 sealed greeting cards, unmailed, dated 2014 through 2025. And Roland Pike held them up in a rubber band, and he laughed. He actually laughed. He said, 12 birthday cards, Your Honor. Written, stamped, never sent. 12 years. This is a man who cannot complete the simplest task in front of him. And Cheryl Dawn said, let me see those. Pike said, ma'am. She said, give them to me. And her own lawyer stood there and had to hand his client the evidence, and the whole room watched him do it. She went through them till she found the one on the bottom, March of 2014, 2 months after her mother died. And she opened it with her thumb, and her hands were not steady, and she read it out loud to that room in a voice that came apart about 4 words in. Cheryl Dawn, your mother always picked these out. She'd write the inside, and I'd sign my name under hers, and I never once had to think what I'd say if she wasn't here to say it first. I stood in that Rite Aid 40 minutes. I'm sorry about the phone. When you called and I didn't say anything, it wasn't because of you. There just wasn't anything in me to get out. It was never you. Not one day of your life was it ever you. Daddy. And she lowered that card and she looked right at me in front of every soul in that room and she said, why didn't you send it? And I told her the truest and the saddest thing I know about myself. I said, because I read it back over and it wasn't enough. And I figured you'd rather have nothing than have something that little. And I reckon that's the whole trouble with me in one sentence, friend. 77 years old, and I have never once been able to tell the difference between a small thing and nothing at all. And then my son-in-law Dale stood up in the gallery with a folder in his hand. He'd been going through the discovery, his own wife's discovery, and he'd found a deed of sale from October of 2011, and he'd found the amount on it, and he'd sat there in that gallery and done the arithmetic and got an answer he could not live with. He said, Your Honor, may I say something? Judge Mullins said no. And then she looked at him a second longer and she said, say it. He said in 2011 we were 4 payments down and about to lose our house. And they told us the bank restructured it. And it wasn't the bank. And he walked it up and handed it to my daughter. She looked at that piece of paper for a long time. And then she stood up in the middle of her own lawsuit and she said, stop. Pike said, Mrs. She said, stop. I'm done. And I have never in my life given that girl enough credit, and I'm going to give it to her now. She stood in a public room in the county she'd spent 20 years being embarrassed about, in front of every man her daddy ever pulled out of a hole, and she took her own case apart with her bare hands. She said her daddy was never cruel, never once, never lazy and never mean, and never in his life laid a hand on her. She said he just went somewhere in 1970 and never told anybody where it was. And then she said the part that near finished me. She said, and I quit going to look for him. I want that on the record too. He didn't stop being my daddy. I stopped being somebody who went looking. Roland Pike sat down and he did not get back up. And then Wyatt Boone got back on that stand, and he told that whole room about 9 hours in 1997, and a brass tag, and a light he still had in a box at his house. And he said the word out loud that not one person in my entire life ever said to me. He said, this man has post-traumatic stress disorder. He has had it since 1970. It is untreated because nobody in his generation was ever handed the word for it. So he did the only thing available to him. He built a wall, and he stood behind it for 56 years. That is not dementia. That's not senility. That is a documented, treatable injury, and this court is about to punish a man for a wound the country gave him and then never came back to check on. And he took that tag out of his pocket, and he set it on the rail. And he said, I'm returning this to its owner. It's been off the hook for 29 years, and I think somebody ought to finally go get him. Judge Mullins denied the petition in about 4 minutes. That was 5 months ago. I'm still on Rockhouse Creek. Same house, same stove. Cheryl Dawn didn't move back, and I didn't want her to. And I want to be plain about that, friend, because I don't want to sell you something that isn't true. We didn't fix it. 11 years don't fix. Some things break too slow to ever mend all the way back. But she comes on Thursdays. Started in March. Just showed up with a sack of tomatoes and stood on my porch not knowing what to do with her hands. Now it's every Thursday and she don't call first anymore, which is how you know. And I'm going to a fellow in Hazard every other week. VA sends me. 77 years old, and I'm sitting in a chair telling a man about 1,968. And I'll be honest with you, I hate every minute of it, and I go anyway, because Wyatt Boone drove down here himself and sat in my kitchen and asked me to, and I have never in my life been able to tell that boy no. Cole's 9. He comes with her most weeks. He wants to know about the tunnels, and I tell him the parts a 9-year-old can have. And one afternoon back in May, we were down at the creek, and he asked me, straight out the way they do, "Papa, were you a hero?" And I said, "No, buddy." He said, "Dr. Boone says you saved him." And I baited his hook, and I thought about it a good while, because a boy that age deserves a real answer. And I said, "Anybody'll go in when there's people watching. The thing is, whether you'd sit down there in the dark with somebody when there's nobody around to see you do it." He said, "Would you?" I said, "I done it once." And he said, "Then do it again," and he cast out into the water, and he had no idea in this world what he'd just said to me. Last month, the squad had a little supper up at the fire hall, folding chairs and paper plates and a coffee urn, which is my favorite kind of gathering there is. Cole wanted to go, and Cheryl Dawn came, and we sat in the back. And Denver Combs got up and said they had one more thing before the pie. He called out 4 names, 4 men that squad has lost since 1961. And then he said they were retiring a number. And he held up a board with a hook on it, and on the hook was a brass tag with a 41 stamped in it. And he said, "This one's coming off the board tonight, because we finally got him out." And that whole room stood up. Not loud. Old men don't do loud. Just chairs scraping back on a concrete floor, and a bunch of ruined lungs getting to their feet, and my daughter beside me with her hand over her mouth. That evening she brought me a box out of her car. Cardboard, old, 12 cards in a rubber band, and the seals all broke. She said, "I read them all." And I said, "I know they ain't much." And she said, "Daddy, they're everything." And she said it mad, friend. She was mad about it, and I understood exactly why, and I don't believe I've ever been forgiven harder in my life. I gave the tag to Cole, told him what it means, told him a man's tag off the hook means somebody's coming, and that's the only thing a tag has ever meant, and don't ever let anybody tell you different. Here's what all of it taught me, and I'll hand it to you the way I'd hand it to a man in the dark. I spent 40 years going in after other people, and I had a light on my hat and a light on my belt and a spare in my kit the whole time, and I never turned a single one of them on where anybody who loved me could find me. I lit up other men's dark for 40 years, and I sat in mine with the switch right there under my thumb. Silence don't kill a family the way meanness does. Meanness at least gives them something to push against. Silence just lets the batteries run down, 1 year at a time, till everybody quits looking. And the quiet ones, the ones who never complain, the ones who carry the whole thing and never make a sound, they're the ones we walk right past. Every day, because they're not asking for anything, and we've all got the nerve to call that fine. Maybe that's you, friend. Maybe you're the one holding it all and showing none of it, because somebody taught you a long time back that your pain was a weight nobody else had any business under. If that's you, hear this from an old man who did it your way for 56 years and damn near lost the only person he had left. The people who love you are not asking you to be all right. They're asking you to be findable. Turn the light on. Let them come get you. That's not weakness. That is the single bravest thing left available to a man our age. So here's the one thing I'd ask of you this week. Think of the quietest person in your life. The veteran who won't talk about it. The daddy who never complains. The husband. The wife. The one who carries it all and shows you nothing. Go tell them out loud that you see them and that they matter. This week. Not someday. Don't wait for a courtroom to make you do it. because I'm here to tell you that courtroom might not come, and if it does, you're going to wish you'd said it 11 years sooner. And here's the question I want you to sit up with tonight, friend. Who in your life has been down in the dark this whole time with their light switched off and you never went looking because they never once made a sound? Now, I'd truly like to know how you see this one, so before you go, tell me down in the comments. Comment 1 if you think I should have opened my mouth the second that lawyer brought up those 40 acres and spared everybody the whole ordeal. Comment 2 if you think I was right to keep quiet and let the truth walk in on its own legs, the way it did. Or comment 3 if you think 12 cards in a footlocker is its own kind of cruelty and a share of how it all fell apart lands square on me. There's no wrong answer, and I read every single one of them. And if you think I had no business letting that girl back up my road on Thursdays after what she tried to do to me, you say so. I won't argue with you. I've argued with myself about it plenty, and I ain't settled it yet. Tell me where in the world you're sitting right now, too, and what the clock says where you're at, because it never quits amazing me how far these stories get from a creek in Kentucky. And if there's a quiet one in your life carrying something nobody can see, a veteran, a parent, a husband, a wife, I'd count it an honor if you'd tell me about them down there. So the next person scrolling by tonight remembers to go look a little closer at somebody they love. If this reached you at all, the kindest thing you could do is subscribe and stay a while, because there's a whole life's worth of these where this one came from. It don't cost you a thing, and it means the world to an old man with a creek out front and a tag that finally come off the hook. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourselves, and go tell the quiet ones you see them while there's still somebody to tell. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Letcher County, Kentucky, to create original content. Any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental. Hollis lived by one rule underground, 2 men in, 2 men out, and it took him 56 years to carry it home. Nobody needs you to be all right. They need you to be reachable. Send the card. Answer the phone. Show up on a Thursday with a sack of tomatoes. The small thing you actually say beats the perfect thing you never send. Somebody's still hoping you will. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, written to entertain you for a little while, and to leave behind a lesson worth carrying into your own week.